What is squash? Have you heard of it? But before I begin, I asked a few of my friends to see if they knew what squash was.
What do you think squash is?
It's a vegetable. Oh, the sport? It's basically like tennis with a ball.
Squash is playing tennis with the wall.
Squash is like tennis, but like indoor. And like the net is smaller.
Clearly, this isn't a well-known sport besides being compared to tennis. And no, I'm not talking about this squash. I'm talking about this squash.
Squash is a competitive sport played by two players in a 9x6 four-wall box court. It's closely related to tennis and racquetball in a closed court. The objective is for each player to hit a ball against the front wall until the other person cannot return. The ball is made of rubber and has 2 yellow dots. Even rackets have evolved over time. And now for the history of the sport. Squash is one of the fittest sports in the world. It is played in 185 countries with 25 million people worldwide. Squash was first played in 1830 in an old boys' Harrow school in England. Universities such as Harvard, Cornell, Yale, UPenn, and many more colleges all have squash in their athletic program. Even the Titanic had a squash court on the first floor. What do most squash courts look like, you might wonder? Traditional squash courts have a white side wall, as well as the front being white and the back being glass. Most pros play on an old glass court, and the venues where the builders create the courts are quite fascinating. Places such as the pyramids, France, Dubai, and so many more. For example, this is a time-lapse of a glass court being built in Malaysia for a world championships. It takes over days to create a stable, proper court for professional players to play in, and all the measurements having to align. But once finished, it's a different experience and a very surreal experience to play in.
Beginning of this video, not many of my friends knew what squash was, but on a personal side, this sport means a lot to me. I've been playing for 8 years, and I roughly have about 8 to 9 tournaments a year. I love this sport because it's very much different from others and challenging. I see many of my friends during squash tournaments, so I had a moment to chat with them on why they think the sport should be popular and what they love about the sport.
Isha Gupta. I'm a freshman at school and I'm really passionate about squash. I live in Redwood City, California, which is about 45 minutes south of San Francisco. And I met Zainab over a squash tournament in Baltimore, and we became friends almost instantaneously. I love squash for a bunch of reasons, but like most sports, it's really physically demanding, technically challenging, and there's a whole tactical and mental aspect that goes on behind the scenes. But what I love most about the sport is the community. Squash has a really small community. For example, JCTs only admit the top 32 players in the country for each division, and so you tend to see the same players every single tournament. And this is kind of how I got to be friends with Zainab and so many other players.
So I started playing squash about 5 years ago, and I love the sport not just because of the sport, but because of the people. I mean, every single tournament is just so much fun, and our community is just so small, and it's really great to see all my friends every tournament.
I've also gotten to travel to many other states, which I wouldn't have gone to otherwise. Every place from Connecticut to San Diego to Washington, D.C. to New York to Philadelphia. Every place has its own food, its own culture, its own weather, its own kinds of people.
Squash is not the most popular sport in the US. I mean, trying to advocate for the sport is really hard just because the sport's name is shared with a fruit, which people bring up all the time. It is so much fun, and I feel like I always have to compare it to racquetball or tennis, but it's so different. The ball is smaller, it's a really fast sport, and it's really difficult actually.
Squash is slowly but surely making its way to the public. To conclude, squash is an interesting but fun sport with a lot of history, and something that everyone should try once in a while.